In 1978, American factories were churning out nearly 18,000 small aircraft every single year. The skies belonged to dreamers. Cessna, Piper, Beechcraft, these manufacturers had cracked the code to affordable flight, or so everyone believed. Then something catastrophic happened. Within 16 years, that number collapsed to just 928 aircraft, a 95% freefall. Factories went silent. Over 100,000 workers lost their jobs. An entire industry evaporated almost overnight. But here's what nobody talks about. For nearly a century, visionaries have chased the same impossible dream, using economies of scale to create the Model T of aviation, an airplane so cheap that anyone could own one. Every single attempt has ended in disaster. In 1933, a government official promised Americans a $700 airplane. It became a national joke. Decades later, a Microsoft billionaire poured over $1 billion into the same dream. He lost everything. Even Cessna, the world's most successful aircraft manufacturer, tried outsourcing production to China for rock-bottom costs. They ended up destroying their own unsold aircraft rather than admit defeat. The economics that built the automobile industry, that revolutionized electronics, that democratized computing, they simply do not work in aviation. And the reason why reveals something disturbing about the future of personal flight. Picture the mid-1970s. American aircraft factories are humming with unprecedented activity. Cessna alone is producing over 8,000 aircraft annually from its sprawling Wichita facilities. Piper's assembly lines, modeled directly after Henry Ford's revolutionary manufacturing system, are churning out affordable airplanes for middle-class dreamers. In 1978, the industry delivers nearly 18,000 aircraft to eager buyers across the country. The dream of an airplane in every garage finally seems tantalizingly close to reality. But here's what everyone missed. This wasn't the first time someone promised to democratize the skies through mass production, and it wouldn't be the last time that promise would catastrophically fail. Rewind to November 1933. The Great Depression has devastated American aviation. Annual production has collapsed from earlier peaks to just 549 aircraft. That's when Eugene Luther Vidal steps into the spotlight with a revolutionary proposal. Olympic decathlete, aviation pioneer, director of the Bureau of Air Commerce, and father of the famous writer Gore Vidal. His vision would supposedly change everything. He announced what he called the Poor Man's Airplane Project, part of a New Deal for aviation. His promise was nothing short of audacious. A mass-produced aircraft, the aviation equivalent of the Model T automobile, for just $700. Think about this for a moment. Vidal wasn't some naive dreamer. He had assembled a coalition of engineers who assured him this target was absolutely achievable. A low-wing monoplane, 2 passengers, Ford automobile engines converted for flight, landing speeds so slow that Superman qualifications wouldn't be required to fly it. The Public Works Administration immediately allocated $500,000 to fund the program. Orders from excited would-be pilots flooded in. The aviation revolution was finally coming to America. Then, reality intervened. By March 1934, opposition had solidified completely. The funds were cancelled. The $700 airplane became, in the words of historians, an object of ridicule that would haunt the remainder of his time in government. Some manufacturers did eventually certify aircraft with converted Ford engines. The cheapest, the Wiley Post Model A, sold for $990. Close, but nowhere near close enough to spark a revolution. Vidal's dream died in the Great Depression, but the fundamental fantasy that mass production could make aviation affordable for ordinary Americans refused to die with it. 70 long years later, a Microsoft billionaire would resurrect this exact vision, backed by over $1 billion in investment capital. What happened next would become the largest financial catastrophe in general aviation history. In 1998, Vern Rayburn believed he had finally cracked the code. Early Microsoft employee, former Symantec CEO, Silicon Valley royalty, with connections that reached the highest levels of the technology world. His plan was elegantly simple. Build a very light jet so inexpensively that it would cost under $1 million. Produce thousands annually. Achieve economies of scale that no aviation company had ever managed before. The credibility behind this venture was staggering. Bill Gates himself became a major investor. Hundreds of millions poured in from believers convinced that software industry thinking could finally revolutionize aviation manufacturing. But here's what Rayburn fundamentally misunderstood. Airplanes are not software. You cannot debug a wing at 30,000 feet. You cannot patch a failed engine with a software update. Every rivet, every wire, every component demands precision that Silicon Valley's move fast and break things philosophy simply cannot accommodate. The numbers tell a devastating story. Eclipse was selling its jets for approximately $1 million each. The actual manufacturing cost exceeded $2 million per aircraft. They were hemorrhaging money on every single airplane they delivered. This wasn't a temporary startup loss. This was financial suicide disguised as disruption. Then came September 2008. Dayjet, an on-demand air taxi service, had ordered 1,400 Eclipse jets. They represented the cornerstone of Rayburn's entire business model. When Dayjet collapsed during the financial crisis, those 1,400 orders evaporated overnight. Eclipse's house of cards came crashing down. Think about the scale of this disaster. In its entire operational history, Eclipse Aviation delivered just 260 aircraft. Total company liabilities exceeded $1 billion. Not millions, billions. It remains the largest financial failure in general aviation history. Nothing else even comes close. But here's what makes this failure truly remarkable. The aircraft themselves were delivered incomplete. Basic navigation systems were missing. The autopilot couldn't track instrument approaches. Owners received jets that couldn't perform functions that 1970s aircraft handled routinely. Eclipse filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in November 2008. By February 2009, that converted to Chapter 7 liquidation. Rayburn's revolutionary company was carved up and sold for scraps. The lesson should have been unmistakable. If a company backed by Microsoft billions, led by technology industry veterans, couldn't achieve economies of scale in aviation, perhaps such economies simply don't exist in this industry. But even as Eclipse collapsed, another company was making the exact same bet. This time, with the most iconic name in aviation behind it. Cessna wasn't some scrappy startup gambling on unproven technology. They were the most successful aircraft manufacturer in history. The Cessna 172 remains the most produced aircraft ever built. If anyone could achieve economies of scale in aviation manufacturing, surely it was them. In 2007, they unveiled the Skycatcher at Oshkosh to massive excitement, a sleek new light sport aircraft designed specifically for affordability and training. CEO Jack Pelton made a bold promise to the waiting crowds: under $100,000, production of 700 aircraft annually. Orders flooded in immediately. Within months, over 1,000 eager deposits were secured. But here's where Cessna made its fatal and decisive calculation. To hit that price point, they outsourced production to China, specifically to Shenyang Aircraft Corporation, a subsidiary of the Aviation Industry Corporation of China, a government-owned consortium. The reaction from American buyers was immediate and overwhelmingly hostile. Then the technical disasters began. During spin testing, a prototype fell into an unrecoverable spiral. The pilot activated the emergency parachute. It failed to deploy. He survived the crash, barely. 6 months later, another prototype was lost under similar circumstances. Engineers scrambled to redesign the entire tail section, adding weight and complexity that rippled through the entire production system. The price started climbing. $109,000 became $119,000, then $149,000, a 40% increase that triggered mass cancellations. Position holders abandoned their orders in droves. Now consider the devastating final numbers. Cessna had planned to deliver 700 aircraft per year. In the first full production year, they delivered exactly 30 aircraft. Total program deliveries reached just 192 before the CEO publicly announced the Skycatcher had no future. But here's the twist nobody expected. Cessna didn't sell the remaining inventory. They didn't discount the unsold airframes. They destroyed them. Between 60 and 70 complete aircraft crushed by heavy equipment in a Kansas lot, rather than admit defeat publicly. Why does this keep happening? The answer lies in aviation's fundamental economics. FAA certification for a new aircraft design costs approximately $25 million. Product liability exposure averages $70,000 to $100,000 per aircraft delivered. And unlike automobiles, planes cannot be mass-produced on automated assembly lines. Each one requires thousands of hours of skilled hand labor with meticulously documented precision. The economics that have revolutionized ground transportation simply do not translate to flight. 3 generations of ambitious attempts, 3 spectacular failures, and a dream that started in 1933 finally, definitively, died in a Kansas factory in 2016. The mathematics of aviation have remained brutally unchanged since Eugene Vidal's $700 dream collapsed in 1934. Aircraft cannot be stamped out on assembly lines like automobiles. Each one demands thousands of hours of skilled labor, millions in certification costs, and decades of liability exposure. The economics that democratize ground transportation simply collapse when applied to flight. Eclipse burned through $1 billion learning this lesson. Cessna, with 80 years of manufacturing experience, learned it again. The average general aviation aircraft flying today is nearly 40 years old, a fleet of antiques because new production remains impossibly expensive. But here's what makes this story more than historical tragedy. As the world desperately seeks solutions to congested highways and crumbling infrastructure, the dream of personal aviation keeps returning. Electric aircraft startups are raising billions right now, promising the same revolution that has failed for nearly a century. The question isn't whether they'll try. The question is whether they've studied why everyone before them failed. or whether they're destined to repeat the most expensive lesson in aviation history. This is only one chapter in the story of flight's unfulfilled promises. Subscribe to discover what comes next and whether the next generation of dreamers will finally crack the code or join the wreckage.